fact, this is just one example, but this whole economic liberalization whose main thrust has been privatization. Privatization of the public sector, privatization of even natural monopolies. You have created a system where natural monopolies such as electricity distribution, water distribution, airports have been allowed to be privatized. So now you have a system where you are forced to buy electricity from a private corporation, which means you have no choice, there is no competition there. You have to pay whatever they demand. The only thing is that there is a regulator which is supposed to regulate the prices. But then this system again provides huge incentives for corrupting the regulator. Because depending upon what the regulator allows you, you can make huge windfall profits. I am dealing with a case of the electricity distribution in Delhi currently, where for 2010-11 these companies wanted a 60% hike in the electricity tariff. And they tried to justify it before the regulator by showing that their costs had gone up by 60%. Fortunately, because this time there was an honest chairman of the regulatory commission, electricity regulatory commission, he got their accounts audited and it was found that in fact their prices need to be brought down by 20% rather than be increased by 60%. They had manipulated and fudged all their accounts. Equipment which was costing 1 crore in the market was being purchased for 5 crores by them from their own sister companies in order to justify their high costs. So this has gone on rampantly, and therefore these policies of privatization, rampant privatization, have created huge incentives for corruption. Joseph Stiglitz in his book Globalization and Its Discontents has a chapter called Who Lost Russia, in which he has pointed out how Russia in the decade of the 90s became a thoroughly corrupt failed state, and primarily on account of the rapid and rampant privatization of the state industry which took place in the 90s. He says that this process of transferring capital assets from public hands to private hands was done in such a corrupt manner that it created, firstly, it led to enormous corruption, it led eventually to Russia becoming a failed state, and it created this corrupt mafia in the country which sits on top of everything. So now once you create this huge incentives for corruption at the top, that corruption is bound to trickle down, and it has spread all over, with the result that every citizen in the country, rich or poor, even corporations, they cannot do business in the country any longer without having to grease palms across the board. You cannot, if you are a poor person, if you are a street vendor, you cannot vend on the streets without paying bribes to the municipal officials and the police officials, etc. And therefore, corruption increased enormously, particularly during this period of liberalization, when the theory was that corruption would decrease by ending the license permit Raj. But in fact, with crony capitalism, etc., it increased rapidly and spread everywhere. So this set the stage for this anti-corruption movement. Now, on the one hand, you increase the incentives for corruption. On the other hand, you did not create any disincentives for corruption by fixing the anti-corruption institutions and allowing them to decay. Primarily, let's focus on the three main anti-corruption institutions: the CBI, the Central Vigilance Commission, and the judiciary, because ultimately people have to be prosecuted and brought to book in the judiciary. It's the judiciary which has to send them to jail, sentence them for corruption, etc. Now with the CBI, the problem was that the CBI is administratively controlled by the same people who are to be investigated by the CBI for corruption. So there is an inbuilt conflict of interest there. Today in the 2G scam, there is an application which has been made for investigating the Home Minister, Mr. Chidambaram, in that case. The investigation is being conducted by the CBI. All the top officers of the CBI come from the Indian Police Service, and their cadre controlling authority is the Home Ministry, which means that the Home Minister decides whether they would be transferred, promoted, suspended, etc. Now obviously there is a conflict of interest and they cannot impartially, fearlessly investigate in such a situation. And that is why the need and the demand arose for having an independent Lokpal institution, an independent ombudsman institution, which would be completely independent of the government, both not just functionally independent of the government, but also financially independent of the government, as well as in terms of the selection, it would be independent of the government. Then the problem with the CVC. The CVC was made functionally independent of the government because of the Central Vigilance Commission Act, by which it was given statutory status. But unfortunately, the selection of the CVC was still left to the government. You have a selection committee consisting of the Prime Minister, Home Minister, Leader of Opposition to select the Central Vigilance Commission, and we have seen that even the Leader of Opposition usually goes along with the government to select weak and pliable persons, because even the Leader of Opposition has been a minister in the past, hopes to become Prime Minister in the future, and therefore does not want a robust, aggressive watchdog who can even bite him. So therefore, they have all colluded to appoint a succession of weak and pliable people as vigilance commissioners. Recently, of course, they tried to appoint Mr. Thomas as the Chief Central Vigilance Commissioner, who had himself facing a charge sheet, a criminal charge sheet for corruption. And yet he was sought to be appointed. Eventually, of course, his appointment was quashed by the Supreme Court when we challenged it, but that was the attempt. Of course, in this case, the Leader of Opposition objected. This was one case where the Leader of Opposition objected, but then the subsequent person who was appointed with the consent of the Leader of Opposition is also not known, was the former Defense Secretary, and is not going to be impartially able to investigate scams in the Defense Ministry, among others. So, the problem with the judiciary, now the judiciary has two kinds of problems. First, the judiciary has become dysfunctional because cases do not get decided. The prosecution of Sukhram for having possessed disproportionate assets is still pending in appeal in the High Court, and the man is out free, and he is going to, the prosecution will not be over, or the appeals will not be over until he dies. Therefore, he will not be successfully brought to book through this judicial system. Moreover, the judiciary itself has become quite corrupt because there is no accountability of the higher judiciary, and the lower judiciary, which is accountable to the higher judiciary, has been naturally, when the higher judiciary becomes corrupt, they cannot rein in the people below them, and that's exactly what has happened. So that is why actually it was in this background that when you had a demand being made by a set of credible people who were seen as selfless and who were proposing a tangible, viable, practical solution to the problem, then there was enormous public sentiment which rallied behind this cause. And that is why we saw a movement which got across the board support in the country, even outside the country, and after a long time people started feeling that yes, by participating in this movement they can change something in the country. People who had become cynical, who had started feeling helpless, hopeless, after a long time started feeling empowered and feeling that maybe by participating in this movement they can bring about some change. And that is why a lot of people got out of their homes, came out on the streets, participated in marches, candlelight processions, dharnas, rallies, etc. It's the kind of movement that the country has not seen for a very, very long time. Now, of course, those who are in power are determined not to allow, to the extent that they can help it, a strong Lokpal legislation. Of course, we have proposed a bill in which we have proposed that there will be this independent authority created, an 11-member authority with a lot of officers, investigating officers under them, who would be selected by a very broad-based selection committee consisting of the Prime Minister, the Home Minister, the Prime Minister, the Leader of Opposition, only 2 politicians, only 1 person from the government, and thereafter you have 9 independent constitutional authorities. So you have the Chief Election Commissioner, the Comptroller and Auditor General, 2 judges of the Supreme Court, 2 Chief Justices of the High Courts, and the last 3 chairmen of this Lokpal institution itself, who would form the selection committee and who would select the Lokpal members in a very transparent selection process. Then they have been given full functional as well as financial autonomy, in the sense that the Lokpal itself will decide how many officers they need to ensure that the investigations are completed within a year. The Lokpal will also make an annual assessment of how many courts are required to try these offences, such that the trials are concluded within a year, and they will recommend that many courts to be set up for trying these offences, and the government would be forced to set up that many courts. And they would have other ancillary powers of recommending the removal of those officers who have been charge-sheeted for corruption. I am not going into the details of the bill, there isn't enough time. Maybe in the discussion or questions I can deal with some of the questions. And this institution is made fully accountable. Some people have raised this issue, how will you ensure that this will not itself become corrupt? We have tried to build in 4 layers of accountability of this institution. First, that it will be mandated to function with complete transparency, inasmuch as every detail of every investigation that they undertake would have to be put up on a public website. Second, that any citizen can make a complaint against any member of the Lokpal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would constitute a bench to examine that complaint, and if they find that a member has committed misconduct, they can order the removal of that member or even the suspension of that member. The Comptroller and Auditor General of India would have to do an annual financial and performance audit of the entire Lokpal institution, and that report of the CAG would go to the Public Accounts Committee in Parliament, who would also look at it, and finally the High Courts and the Supreme Courts would have the power of judicial review over every order of the Lokpal. So that hopefully will prevent corruption within the Lokpal institution. In the government's bill, there are lots of problems. Firstly, the selection is controlled. The government has brought a bill in Parliament which is terribly flawed. In fact, I have called it the promotion of corruption bill rather than the Lokpal bill, where they have provided for a Lokpal which is selected by the government, which is controlled by the government because the government has the power to suspend any member of the Lokpal, and the jurisdiction of the Lokpal has been severely limited. In our case, the Lokpal can investigate any offense of corruption committed by any public servant from the Prime Minister to the peon. Central public servants would be under the Lokpal, state public servants would be under the Lokayukts, which would have to be set up in every state on the same pattern as the Lokpal under our bill. In the government's bill, the jurisdiction of the Lokpal has been restricted to only what they call class 1 public servants, which are only 60,000, about 40 lakh public servants. So just 1.5% or 2% of the public servants come within the jurisdiction of the Lokpal, and even from that the Prime Minister has been removed, the members of Parliament have been effectively removed, and the higher judiciary has been removed. In fact, one of the problems with the judiciary is that, as I said, it's totally unaccountable. There is nobody who has any disciplinary authority over the higher judiciary except impeachment, and that we have seen as an impractical process. Even criminal investigation for corruption against judges of the High Court and the Supreme Court cannot be done without the prior permission of the Chief Justice of India because of a Supreme Court judgment in 1991 in Veeraswamy's case. And since then we have seen that virtually no judge of the High Court or the Supreme Court has been subjected to corruption investigation or criminal investigation because these permissions are hardly ever given. Because even we have found even honest Chief Justices do not grant permissions because they feel that as head of the judicial family they have a duty to protect members of their judicial family. And that is why we felt that since the Lokpal is being set up as an independent institution, independent of the government as well as independent of the judiciary, that should be given the jurisdiction to investigate corruption against the judges of the higher judiciary also. But the government has been resisting it, as a result of which in the bill they have excluded that from the jurisdiction. The bill is now before the Parliamentary Standing Committee. We are likely to, they have been hearing various people, we are likely to go before the committee probably on the 3rd and 4th of November. What will come out of it, what will finally be passed in Parliament is still too early to say. But we expect that the Standing Committee will recommend several amendments to the government's bill to bring it more in line with our bill. Of course, they don't want to create an effective independent institution against corruption. But now I think they have seen the writing on the wall. They have seen that there is this Jan Lokpal bill which we have proposed enjoys enormous public support. Every opinion poll has been showing, or every referendum that we have done in different parts of the country is showing that more than 80% of the people support the Jan Lokpal bill. And the government is also, and the political parties are also beginning to realize that if they do not support it, they will have to pay a political price for it. So hopefully they will bring it to a large extent in line with what we have proposed, but we still have to see.